You're listening to the Friends Talking Nerdy Podcast Network.
Friends Talking Nerdy!
Hey guys, it's the Reverend Tracy here. In honor of Mental Health Awareness Month, Tim and I wanted to touch on a topic that has touched both our lives personally, but might be triggering for some people. Our topic today is suicide awareness. We will be sharing things like quotes from survivors, information gained from studies out there on the topic, and personal stories of how we've each been affected by suicide. If this topic is not for you, please feel free to pass or maybe come back to it on a day that you're in a better mental space. But for the rest of you guys, we genuinely hope you enjoy the show. And of course, if you or somebody you know is struggling with thoughts of self-harm, please consider calling the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That number is 1-800-273-8255 or 1-800-273-TALK for those of you that still actually have phones with those letters on them. There are friends on the line to help you.
If your friends are nerdy and you are nerdy too, I want to talk to you. Friends Talking Nerdy.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Friends Talking Nerdy. This is Tim Jousma, and joining me all the way in Portland, Maine, it is Her Holiness, the Reverend Tracy. How you doing?
Oh, I'm good, Tim. You know, we've finally thawed out. It's getting warm there, and while the rest of the country drives on the right side of the road, in Maine we drive on what's left of the road. Okay. So lots of potholes, basically, is what I'm getting at. That's like the biggest thing. I was actually having a whole conversation with some of my co-bagelas at my bagel shop today, and we were just having a discussion about this pipe that seems to have emerged in the middle of one of the main streets here.
Okay.
So, and all they've done is like taken spray paint and like kind of put a blue circle like right around it. So it's just like straddle that with your car, don't hit it with your tire. That being said, like it's overall pretty good. It's been nice and sunny. Trying to get into some projects and things. You know, we mentioned spring cleaning recently, so I think it's just that time to kind of get out of any mental funks, and the bright sunny weather really helps. What about you? What have you been up to?
Indeed. I have started my house sitting gig for the summer. A friend of Aubrey's needed some help with house sitting. They were going to be out of town. So for the summer, I'm going to be hanging out with 5 hot chicks. What do I mean by that? 2 adult chickens and 3 baby chickens. So I get to channel my inner farmer. I mean, like I'm a first generation city boy. Like my family, for the most part, is all country. So this is like weird, kind of in a way, reliving kind of like my past, family past in the city, I guess, with some chickens. But it's definitely been really, really fun hanging out with them. The baby chickens too are the funniest. Like there are 2 little black ones and a big gray one. The black ones like run around all scared, but the gray one is bigger, of course, so it's more curious, you know. And so every time I like open up the cage, the gray one wants to come and like nibble on the hair on my wrist. You know, I'm thinking it's like rice or something like that. Just come up, you know, nibble on it. And but it's been fun. I mean, I have missed having animals around ever since Phil and Sherman unfortunately passed away. So getting to spend the summer with some animals, especially with the hectic couple of years I've had, is definitely something high on my list of good things this year for me.
Yeah. So are these like just house pet chickens? Or
well, it's in a residential neighborhood. The backyard is pretty big, so it's just kind of like she's just raising chickens. And the fun part is I get all the eggs I want during the summer. In fact, earlier I went out and grabbed an egg, plopped it in the fridge. It did feel weird the other day when I did boil some eggs in the kitchen with the baby chickens in the other room. I'm looking like, hope this isn't too awkward. You know?
It's okay. They don't know, I don't think. They haven't proven any sort of chicken being able to acknowledge that they understand the egg is them.
Yeah. Like, well, yeah. Even the grown-up chickens. Like, I took one of the eggs out of the coop and like showed it to the chickens, and they just pecked at it. It's like, okay, you don't want it.
It's like you just know you're supposed to sit on this. Like, fun fact. So I was a farm kid, right? Like I removed myself from farm life and went to the city. Excuse me, really quick.
The Reverend's coughing.
No, just like a crazy frog in my throat. So I just didn't want to try to talk through that. But anyway, I was raised like on a farm. So we had chickens, and like, I don't know how emotionally attached you could say chickens are to their eggs, because we used to replace them with like porcelain doorknobs because it just kept them in a certain like brooding type phase. Like, it was basically a way of tricking chickens into just kind of sitting and continuing to have eggs and stuff, I guess. But yeah, I just remembered that was like something that we did. I don't know. I haven't tried to look into raising chickens again yet as an adult, but I might do it. I miss having chickens. They have personality, honestly. My
do?
mom, yeah, I remember one liked to cuddle. And people laugh at that. Like, it is kind of silly to think about that. But yeah, like, we had baby chicks and we'd handle them, and you scratch them under their little jaw and their chin, and they'll nestle right down and be your buddy. So I could see like people just raising them to have them as pets and companions and not necessarily food. But, you know, eggs are also kind of nice to have. They will kick out a lot of eggs. People with chickens tend to give away eggs.
Yeah, like I've already filled up like a whole 12-pack, you know, just like the couple of days I've been here already. So it's yeah, I'm going to be having a lot of eggs this summer.
Well, and fun fact out there, and please feel free to double check this, but you don't have to refrigerate eggs that have never been refrigerated. That's actually one of those hacks for people that go out on water for long periods of time. There's like a list of things you don't need to refrigerate. And if you can get farm fresh eggs, as long as they have never been in the fridge, they'll kind of stay good for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't necessarily have to refrigerate them when you've got that situation. That's why it's like in olden times, the eggs just sat in a basket. Like, you know, the little basket of eggs that was just in the kitchen, like, that is because they didn't need to be refrigerated. They just brought them in, cleaned them up, like, didn't even clean them. I don't think you clean them like right before you use them, I think.
I mean, not even that. I mean, like, the shell, when I got out, the shell was like nice and clean. There was like no residue or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like I'm eating the shell anyway. So.
I mean, I used to collect them. That was my job as a kid, because by the time we moved, like, I was still really young, so I didn't really get to go up the chain. Like, I was allowed to be in the bunny barn and the chicken coop, which was hilarious because the chicken coop, like, was the 2 times I got chased by animals was in the fucking hen house. But anyway, once was a turkey and once was a chicken snake, and we can just leave it at that. We can get into my, you know, you guys can hear the dueling banjos play in the background while I tell country stories like some other time.
We'll leave that for the winter, you know.
Well, I thought we told the turkey story like around Thanksgiving for some reason. So, but anyway, yeah, like, I mean, every now and then there might be something on it, because come on, it's birds and a thing. Like, there's dirt out there, but yeah, they don't really come out messy.
Yeah, no discharge or anything like that. But it's overall, I've been having a good time here playing with them. And also, too, I mean, they are animals. I mean, even though they have smaller heads, smaller brains, they're not going to, you know, have as much interaction with humans as like a dog or a cat, but they're still living beings. They, you know, if you treat them nice, they're going to appreciate it, you know. So that's how I feel about it, you know, which would make me a very bad farmer. Like, you know, if it was like, Tim, you're starving, you can kill this chicken and eat or die, I would die.
If there's like, I don't know why this is making me think of like my favorite comic strip from Hyperbole and a Half. And it was, I think it's titled something like How a Fish Almost Destroyed My Childhood. I might need to find that for you to read.
Okay.
Just inspired by what you just said there.
Yeah, and we could put that on the board too. But anyway, the topic at hand today, we are going to be talking about something serious here, but we did want to start off by acknowledging the passing of a country music legend. Naomi Judd, last week, I forgot the specific day, it was announced that unfortunately she did pass away due to suicide. And there was a recent interview within the past couple of days here on Good Morning America with Ashley Judd, one of her daughters. And it was confirmed that Naomi Judd had a long history with mental illness and unfortunately shot herself. So today, being that it is Mental Health Awareness Month, and you know, we, you know, in our own personal lives have known the importance about talking about this stuff, not holding it in. We wanted to talk about suicide today.
Yes. And namely, we did also want to talk about, something that we have gotten some feedback on is you guys like that we get personal. So we did want to talk about how it has touched both of our lives personally. And then, of course, we also wanted to nerd out about it a little bit, right? Like find some actual facts about it, because what is awareness if not sharing facts about what something is or some of the real life experiences around them?
Indeed, indeed. So we'll start off. I mean, what was your first introduction to the whole idea of suicide, I guess?
Well, I mean, I know it was always kind of talked about, right? Because I can't remember a time in my life that uh, it wasn't somewhat of a topic like, right? I mean, I guess in the general of, I knew the idea was that people thought it was a little bit of a, a coward's way out, but I don't remember how young it was that I was aware that that was kind of how it was thought of, right? And again, I'm going to preface for anybody who doesn't know, because if you're newer to the show, I was raised in Texas, so kind of small town. So my first experience with it, though, was in college. I went to a Christian university. I normally leave it vague where I went. So I guess my first experience with it, as far as it happening in my life or to somebody that I knew, was in college. I went to a Christian university, which makes it kind of an interesting level of how that got dealt with. And, I don't say which one. I've talked about my Christian university experience before. This was definitely one of those that was eye-opening for me in a way. Like when it happened, it was just kind of a hush across the entire campus. Because, I mean, those universities are private, so it's not huge.
Right.
There was a lot of weird, dumb social cliquey stuff that was going on in the background that led up to my friend ending his own life. And granted, I do want to put this thought out there early. I don't want to say that anybody is ever to blame for somebody ending their own life, right? It's just I see where it can be a contributing factor with somebody who is struggling with some mental wellness, though. And there was some social stuff going on, very cliquey. And I remember being really disappointed that one of the social clubs that was involved in a lot of it, was more interested in covering their ass that they had ever been mean to him than there was concern for him being gone. It's been a long time now, because this was my first run in college, and I graduated high school in 2003, just to kind of give some dates for people.
Right.
But so I think this was about 2004 or 2005. We'll get into my memory not being great around this time too. But my timeline's a little bit off, but I know that it happened kind of early on into my college career. But yeah, it was super jarring because we had actually been kind of slightly romantic right before this had happened. We had gone on a walk and had a really nice talk and a time, and had wound up making out at this baseball field. It was kind of nuts. And that's the stuff that makes me smile, right? Because we can still think about people that we've lost and smile. And so those are some of the memories that take me back. His name was Brian. I see no reason to hide a first name. But yeah, when Brian passed, it was really jarring. I still remember somebody came to my door, the RA at the time, and I had already heard a lot of whispers because I had gone to the cafeteria. It was whatever year The Passion of the Christ came out. Because unfortunately, I had just seen that, which is such an emotionally wrenching movie, especially given the time of my life where I was at a Christian university, and I was, kind of committed to, I was a Christian. I considered myself a Christian at the time. So I took it with kind of that seriousness of seeing this visual interpretation of what happened to Jesus Christ, right? So It could be understandable how that already puts you at a very emotional space. So then we get back to campus, we go to eat, and we hear that there was ambulances at the boys' dorms, and then, kind of whispers of, Brian's name had come up. And I just remember on the ride home, my RA, who later came to my door, had happened to go to the movie with me, or with us. We went as a group. And she had told me, she looked at me and said, "Hey, what's Brian's last name?" And, I said what it was. So then we get to the cafeteria, and I'm hearing all this whispering about stuff. And I just at that point, I knew. I knew kind of what had happened to my friend, but I super didn't want it to be true. And then I went back to my dorm room with my roommate at the time. And that knock happened at the door. And I will say this just to emphasize the effect that this has on people when you're gone. If this is something that is, I remember that was the most I ever related to the term wailing, was when my friend came to the door and told me that my friend was gone. Because, she told me, hey, I think you had already heard, because she was a kid too, to be fair, like to send an RA to go do that, like seemed so fucked up in my head. Like at this point, like now in hindsight, like they're just barely kids above you, like in college. So she handled it as best as she could, so she wanted to say it, but, she kind of pussyfooted around it. But, I said, I just have two questions. Was it Brian? She said, yes. And I said, did he make it? And that's, when she said no, I literally hit the floor. And then, funeral eventually happens. And I still remember, like, it went to the whole, you come up and you do the viewing, the say goodbye thing, right?
Right.
And of course, this is the first time, right? This is somebody my age. And I think this was when I pretty much decided I don't know how I feel about going to funerals. Like, and it is no disrespect to the person in the casket. Like, it was just a really eerie experience. Being one of the first ones that I went to, because I wound up not being able to go to like kind of my grandparents because they lived far away. So where a lot of people had already had some experiences with going to funerals, like it was super odd for the first one that I went to be somebody like my age.
Yeah.
And I still remember like that went to go to like the lineup to walk up there, and I just froze. I never did go up. I think I wound up just kind of standing there, and one of the ushers or something just kind of took me by the arms, like, it's okay, like just come over here. You don't have to. Yeah. And and I never was mad at him. I don't think. If I was, I mean, I guess I don't want to say I never was. I'm sure there were flashes, right? Because that's a very innocent and genuine place to go. You're frustrated because it goes back to that. Well, they gave up. And I learned more about it later, I guess, that let me kind of process that in time in a more healing way. And now it's like, I can think back and smile about, he used to have a SpongeBob shirt that said something like sexy on it, but he always wore like this leather jacket that covered up just enough so it just looked like he was wearing a shirt that said sex. And like he always had this guitar that he took everywhere and played. And it stinks that basically he succumbed to something that may have been able to have an intervention, but it happened. And it still, of course, it affected me a lot, right? Right. When you know somebody and it's that close to you, of course, that's going to kind of really affect you, especially when you don't really have like a counselor or a psychologist to like go to and really work those things out. Yep.
It reminds me of my intro to the whole thing, and it involves my dad. Happened in middle school. One day, my sister and I and my mother were at home. We were all watching TV and the phone rings. My sister picks it up and starts talking, and, just through overhearing, I hear it's my dad. But, when my sister's talking, I notice a weird look on my sister's face. And then she, says, hey, Tim, Dad wants to talk to you, and then handed the phone to me. But then she goes to my mother, and I talk to my dad, and my dad is on the phone. He's emotional, which if you've ever met my dad, he's not emotional, at all. And he was telling me goodbye. He didn't say he was going to kill himself, but he just said, I wanted to say I love you, and I just wanted to say goodbye. And I'm in middle school. I'm like in 8th grade, like just in a like a I'm like awkward, goofy hair, just goofy everything, unable to really socially, enjoy my teenage years, I guess. And then I have to have that thrown on me, and ultimately I ended up passing the phone to my mother. She was able to dig a little deeper, and then ultimately she was able to call the police and get him some help. And he ultimately did go like on a 72-hour hold after that. I still have resentment towards him because of that. Not, to be clear, not because he attempted it, not because he called to say the goodbye, but because He never talked to us after that about it. I think the common thing in our family, just it seems like generational, is that it seems like if something big like that happens, you don't talk about it. And that's, why thinking back on that memory still rubs me quite wrong. It's like, again, to be clear, folks that are listening, his attempt is not what I was angry at. Him calling out, saying, goodbye. That's not what I was angry at. It's the fact that he didn't take the time, months or years afterwards to say, I'm sorry.
Would you say it would be similar as if you always like, for example, if you had the type of relationship where you had arguments and disagreements and they'd maybe take it too far, but there's never like an apology or talking about it after the fact? Like, is that more of like the kind of, it happens to be related to a suicide attempt or suicidal ideation. Excuse me. Yeah. And I can understand. I was also kind of I had that feeling of like, I couldn't talk about things though. Right. I had that in my family, and I don't know if that was, I guess you did kind of explain that, right? For me, it was just that I never felt like anything I was dealing with or dealt with was ever taken seriously. Like everybody just in my family tended to joke that I was a hypochondriac. So especially when I did start to really struggle with mental health, I didn't even know how to talk about it because I had kind of been passively trained as a kid that nothing I did nothing I experienced seemed to matter. Like it didn't seem to take precedent over the adult feelings or the adult needs. It's kind of interesting. I hear a lot about reparenting, and I've thought about trying to write this concept down in words, but I'm thinking of a new concept of retraining the elephant that kind of talks about baby elephants, are trained with that rope around their foot or whatever, right? Like, have you ever heard how elephants are trained?
No.
Oh, okay. So super fun side nerd fact that we're going to get into really quick is that when elephants are trained, like for circus, they're often only held like by a very tiny rope, like when they're in captivity. And it's something they could easily break away from. They're huge animals. But the thing is they start conditioning elephants as babies. So it's the same size rope as when they were a baby, but because they couldn't break it as a baby, they believe they can't as an adult. So it's like, because I was kind of raised with this conditioning, I had a very hard time for a long time, and I still struggle with like expressing like my wants and needs and stuff like that.
Okay, wonderful technology. The things we do for you people. If you only knew the struggles of what it means.
It's real. Cross platform at this point. The struggles are real, but we're here. We will persevere.
Thank you, fuckers at Zoom. Anyway. Yeah. Well, for me, my teenage years, like suicide, had like kind of an impact. I think back in high school, there was a girl there by the name of Michelle. I didn't know her personally. She was more of an acquaintance of my sister, but she was somebody that was part of like the lunch group. We had a big enough school, so they would split people up in terms of when you went to lunch. Like I remember one instance, like she was in front of me, there was a dickhead behind me, and the dickhead was talking to his friend like, oh, look at those two, they're nerds, they're gonna get married and all that. And like I had already had interactions with a guy. He was like one of those little punks that were brave until you stepped up, into their face.
Classic.
Those type of people. So I rolled my eyes, but I could see it really affected her, and I remember like there was one time too to where like she got her lunch and was like taking, like we had like a 2-level cafeteria. There was like a cafeteria, and some people would take their lunch like downstairs to like the lobby to the gym and all that. And she was walking down and she tripped and spilled all her food. Everybody laughed at her. And it was just so sad. And then just one day, I heard the news. She ended up killing herself. I don't know how she did it, but she did it. She was living, I guess, with her grandmother, and her grandmother unfortunately found her, sadly, and we ended up having a school assembly about it. And the sad part was, like, most of the people in that assembly couldn't have cared less to be there. And just a kick in the gut. And then, of course, the really big thing, the folks that listen to the show heard me talk a lot about it on my birthday episode, was what happened to Kurt Cobain. Yeah. I mean, for me, 94, like I remember being at home on that day after school. It was live at 5:30 on the NBC station on Channel 8. I always had the news on for some reason, because there was a time on that show where my sister and I would call, and I actually bet my sister once to like say something stupid on the air, and she did. That was pretty funny. But anyway, I was just sitting there doing my schoolwork, had the news on in the background, and then the news reporter made the announcement that Kurt Cobain shot himself, and I just shot up. I was like, what? Turned to MTV, because it wasn't real until MTV confirmed it, and it was that announcement that I'm sure you can find on YouTube of Kurt Loder announcing that he did indeed kill himself, and they ultimately played Nirvana Unplugged on loop for a good couple of days, and just like days after that, just like seeing, Courtney Love, how she handled it. Like, Courtney Love is a mess of a human being in a lot of ways. I think she would be the first to admit that. Mm-hmm. But what she did after Kurt Cobain's death saved a lot of lives. I mean, she read his suicide note publicly. Not all of it. There were some personal things that she kept, but she did read that publicly. She would talk to fans, like the park next door to their final home, the park that I visited and, had a breakdown at, she would just talk to people and just, it's like, when you're a high schooler and you see somebody on MTV, or just TV in general, you think they got it made, and then, just hearing that, that life can suck, even if you are a rich and famous rock star, that still sits with me in a lot of ways. It was definitely one of the most jarring things, of my childhood in regards to suicide, and, something I've thought of with my various attempts over the years.
Yeah. And I actually looked it up really quick because I wanted to remember at what point in my schooling career that all happened. So Passion of the Christ came out late February of 2004. So I graduated high school in 2003. So this was actually during my freshman year of college that all went down. So really early in. And now that I'm recalling like some of the drama with that club that I mentioned, like that was like, okay, yeah, because that would have been the first year. Because, pledge weeks and stuff like that would have just been a few months prior, because that always happened. I mean, they didn't call them pledge weeks because that's what, the other colleges call them. I forget what it was. They had their own dumb, cute term. It was still hazing. It was another form of hazing.
Hazing for Christ. Hazing
for Jesus, because, that made sense. No, that was actually why I walked out of pledge week or whatever they called it. But yeah, so, and I do recall, so jumping later, as far as like famous suicides that affected me, Robin Williams, like completely broke my heart when I heard that happen, especially because he did have quotes out there where he talks, and I have been sharing those for anybody on our, Facebook or Instagram. You'll see that I've been sharing some Robin Williams quotes in honor of Mental Health Awareness Month, because he did try to speak about, those topics, and I always really respected that. But it was really gutting. I loved Robin Williams, man, because he was a big part of my childhood, especially a movie, Mrs. Doubtfire, because I was a kid that was taken away from my dad during a divorce. And that movie, like, oh man, I used to daydream that my dad would like secretly dress up and be my babysitter one day. You know what I mean? Like that's so to say that, like, he was always a big piece of something that I associate with good feelings and good ways of processing and thinking of things. Like, and I mean, he was the genie, and he was Mrs. Doubtfire, and he was in so many things. Like later on, he did Jungle Book, and because he was just in so much for so long. And then I still remember like later realizing like, when my childhood version of him was ruined, when he did that stand-up special that everybody's like, oh my God, his humor, it's just wow. And it's
Wow.
like, yeah, it's like what Bob Saget said, like, what did you want me to do? Just be Danny Tanner? Like, I'm a comedian. Just because I play roles doesn't mean that that is necessarily my humor. So that was definitely his time for that. Like,
Yeah.
I will never forget the visual of him talking about like putting his arm like in here when he sneezes is like going down on a very bushy woman or something. Like, I watched that and I was like, oh, my childhood is over. Like,
Oh,
and
man.
see, and I love that I can like laugh and share like my experience of Robin Williams, because that's just like, you know, when Gene Wilder died, I mean, he died of a disease, which I will emphasize over and over that I feel suicide is just the terminal end of a disease, a lot like cancer can be. That, you know, when Gene Wilder died, like a lot of people were affected, right? So that concept that just because you don't know somebody personally, like, doesn't actually mean that they don't have like personal influence on your life. And that's where I've always understood, like, when people cry when a celebrity dies. So I took it very guttingly when Robin Williams committed suicide, especially because it was after my attempt. So my attempt was after surviving my friend Brian's, you know, terminal end. And so having Robin Williams go out that way, like, there is just something so extra gutting about that. That I had a really hard time processing that for a little while. And I didn't even know how to think about it, in the sense of, I did for a while think it was silly to get upset when like a celebrity passed. But so he was equally the first one that was tied into my childhood in that way. But then like how he went seemed to be so jarring, like in an extra way. So it was kind of a first experience of both, like losing a celebrity that actually meant something in my personal life as my childhood, and then also losing them in such a way that was just, for my experience in life, extra gutting.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I heard the news too. Like, I mean, for me, I have even more connection with him. Like, think Mork and Mindy. I mean, that's from my era. I remember that growing up.
Well, actually, hey, I've gone in. Remember, I was a farm kid. So, yeah, Mork and Mindy was actually probably the first time. Nanu, because we had to go do all the farm stuff after school. So we didn't watch like a lot of the shows the other kids in school watched. We watched Nick at Night, like, to wind down. So it was a lot of Mary Tyler Moore, Dick Van Dyke, Mork and Mindy. So, yeah, like, even back then, he's been around.
Yeah, there's one joke that I love that he did, and it went over my head at first. It was like an old stand-up that he did. He started off with, "I'd like to thank my father for coming," and then people took a minute to think about it.
Oh my God, and what I love is he was such a master at that humor. Just a little side nerd about Robin Williams. Like, he was great at just letting things dangle. Like, Donner, Party of Five, or whatever it was, that was in Mrs. Doubtfire, I think. Like, he was really great. Like, he could do it with dark stuff. He could do it with innocent stuff. He just had a way of, like, pitching jokes that I think was just beautiful. He was so great to experience in all of his forms, as an actor that more catered to being goofy and children, to, like, 1 Hour Photo was actually, I thought that was really good. And that was like the first time I saw him like do something like
Death to Smoochie.
Oh my God, that's right. Death to Smoochie. And The Birdcage, by the way, still one of my top favorite movies. I love The Birdcage. I don't know. Maybe I'll try to look that up and watch it, since we talked a lot about him today. Like, I start thinking about Robin Williams, and it makes me want to go back and reminisce.
And it makes me think too, like, one of the quotes you talked about that you shared from him was how he talked about, you know, sad people are always the happiest. And I think back to his college roommate, one Christopher Reeve. They both went to Juilliard together. And after Christopher Reeve had his accident where he broke his neck and was paralyzed, he was depressed in the hospital. But then Robin Williams showed up and just did his thing. Just went in there, just make joke after joke after joke, and, got him laughing again. And Christopher Reeve said that was the first thing that, kind of lit the fire in him to kind of like to let him know that it's going to be okay. And I think for me, like the times that I've dealt with suicide, and we're going to go on and we'll talk more about personal stuff here going on. But I think, the thing about suicide ultimately is that you do have that feeling of hopelessness. And, it's like, that's that's one reason, I guess, why we want to talk about it today is that, you do have that feeling of hopelessness and you don't want to talk about it either, just because you don't want to feel that way. And I remember, like, I was working at Apple when it happened, and when it was announced that he passed, and, I was back in the genius room, quote unquote, bunch of douchebags back there. Anyway, but one of the guys came in, one of the hosts, one of the good guys that worked at Apple, one of the co-hosts of the Capeless Crusaders podcast came back, and he looked like he was just gutted. And he came back and says, news came out that Robin Williams killed himself, and just everybody in the back just like, what? Like you did, like him? And just yeah. It was so sad.
I know it surprised a lot of people, and it even surprised me. I don't think a lot of those quotes really came out, unfortunately, until after he passed away. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, it seems like they'd be more relevant and be passed around more, right? But I don't remember like associating Robin Williams with a mental health awareness person or a mental health warrior, right? Uh-huh. Until after. And then I found that he had quotes on it. And then it just seemed obvious that he, understood that struggle, because I can definitely relate. Like, I would never want anybody to feel the way I felt leading up to deciding to try. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, being in that mindset, I would never want anybody to feel that way. And I think that's why, like, I'm one of those annoying people, and I've tried to be better about it, right? Because people just need to feel their feelings. I need to understand that, like, not everything is, like, to a level of, I can't live anymore, like, in somebody's head. And, right. It's not my job to always make them laugh. But I do tend to resort to a lot of humor, and I'll try to make people, that's my go-to, is I try to make people laugh anytime they feel sad or, not mad. That one doesn't tend to go over very well, but when people are down, I tend to go to humor and want to make them laugh.
Yeah. I know I just ran into your car, but I got a good knock joke. No.
How about some deflection with humor? Thoughts?
Zing. But yeah, it is weird too, because like you have all these instances of people that have killed themselves that you would think that you would get to a point to where you would tell yourself that, you would not do it again. And, and I've said that before, but I've attempted again, and I've talked on the show about my struggles. The last time I really tried was in 2019. Like everything felt like it was just falling apart. Like just nothing was going right. It felt like I was losing everything. And I had convinced myself that nobody would care. Nobody would care. And, I attempted it. Obviously didn't work, but, I got to thank my cat. I mean, Phil, I had just adopted him like a couple of weeks beforehand. And, he was 12 years old, old guy, but, relatively good health and just such an innocent little soul. And just the way he would look at me, just he loved me. And it's just like, if I hadn't adopted him, I don't know if we're talking today.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, I attempted in college. It was after my friend Brian had died. It'd been a few years. So, and just, I've had stuff happen. I think I've kind of at least mentioned in the past that I have had things kind of happen a few times throughout my life that seems to have led up to this. That's where it's like I do try to talk about CPTSD on, There Is Life After Trauma, which is my personal Instagram. That's the thing that I kind of more think fits for me. So back then, I wouldn't have known about CPTSD. And of course, like it being what it is, suicidal thoughts and ideation, is a thing that can come as part of that. So I had been through a lot of situations that kind of set my brain up to be kind of negative. Because what can happen with CPTSD is essentially the concept is you had a lot of cortisol dumped into your brain in younger years, and that can essentially act as a brain trauma, much like PTSD. But because of the chronic nature, it can take some undoing, right? It kind of goes back to when you expose certain hormones or chemicals to a child's brain while it is developing, it can be very hard to reverse. From what I've understood of CPTSD, which granted, this is something I am looking into talking to a doctor about on an official capacity, to be totally clear on this, is that's why it's kind of interesting, is because but anywho, that's what I feel kind of led up to this. There were social things I go back to. I wasn't a big fan of this private Christian university. There was kind of all of this cliquey stuff, and it did honestly turn into where one day one of my friends, which I'm throwing in quotes for anybody that can't see me, came and had a talk with me and told me that I guess her job had essentially been to keep me away from any of the social gatherings of our friend group. And so when you are somebody who already deals with like those self-value issues, and especially like I didn't have good counseling to be in to help guide me at the time, I didn't have access, and that's our public health or our health system, and that's like a whole other topic on its own. So basically I was dealing with all of those paranoid type level thoughts that you deal with when you're a person with anxiety.
Right.
Except it was all confirmed. Like, it's kind of funny to think about in a way, because that doesn't normally happen, right? Like, normally when you're a person that deals with like the social anxiety and things like that, you can go to it's all in your head, that you're making it up. So there is just something so jarring and about by being told that it was actually true. And it really impacted, yeah.
Yeah, and I can imagine, too, how that probably did not help you going forward either, because if it was confirmed once, it could happen again.
I still, to be totally honest, to this day, I made a joke to somebody at work yesterday, by the way. They were talking about another one of my coworkers, saying, you know what, I can't actually tell if they like me or not, or just find me annoying. And I turned to them and I said, well, I just operate on the assumption that everybody finds me a little bit annoying, and I just work with that. And so it was a place of humor, but it's also a place of truth. Like, I think, I don't know, I don't want to say that I will always struggle with it, but I do to this day, that I struggle with accepting that people actually like me and want to hang out with me.
Yeah.
And especially like as an adult, right? Because most of the time it's not personal. They don't want to hang out. Adults are just fucking busy. So it's easier to get into the logic of it, I guess, and help myself now. Now that I'm just getting older and realizing like, well, shit, half the time I don't hang out with people because I'm busy. So at least there's that part of it, but it still does affect me. I hope one day it doesn't. And I'm going to still keep trying to work towards it not. But that's the thing, that triggering thing, because it goes back to on the off chance anybody from those times listens to this, even if you were one of the people who talked this poor person into playing this shitty role, because in hindsight, I feel so bad for her that they like got her to do, because she felt guilty. That's why she talked to me about it. She didn't want to do it. Right. So unpacking it years later, I kind of understand, but I don't blame any of them. I really don't. I was struggling with an illness that I had no tools for how to manage, no healthcare to assist me in managing it, like with that, like that way of being able to do it. So I guess just to kind of put it bluntly, I almost succumbed to that final stage, right? It's kind of like how people can have cancer and have no idea that they had cancer and pass from it, because they didn't know any of the symptoms that they were having was cancer, or, they never saw a doctor. Right. And, so I kind of felt like that's what was going on with me. It was the equivalent of not knowing. I don't want to go into any methods. I think that's kind of the wisest way to cover. But I did kind of attempt in a way that when I came to from the experience, it was more just jarring at that point. And I was just really focused. I was very embarrassed about it for a while. But I remember like just kind of from that point, I didn't know what I was going to do about what was going on with me, but I knew that wasn't the answer. Like, there was something about coming to, and what's cool is there's an article I'm going to bring up later that I found later on, like a few years after my attempt, that really kind of helped me understand that feeling of like that kind of concept that you can kind of realize like, okay, there are other ways to deal with this. Something is wrong and I need help now.
Now, after your attempt, how long did it take you to reach for help?
Reach for was immediate. Successfully find was a bigger struggle. Now, I do want to talk about what did eventually help me. What didn't, though, was the counselor on the Christian campus. That was one of those things that kind of, that experience was what woke me up that might not necessarily be what I wanted to invest my life in as far as being part of that Sangha, that community. There were some things that happened later that kind of got brushed out of the way that, you know, it just made me realize I needed to seek help somewhere else. Right. And she did help me get on medication. But the problem with the medication was I just didn't care about not caring anymore. Like, it kind of took away the awkward anxiety. Like, I used to kind of feel anxious about not caring. So it kind of took away some of that. But then I was still starting to like dip in my grades and I wasn't getting stuff done. But I did end up finding a sliding scale therapist. And so I did want to highlight that this is cool because this is really kind of part of when I started to recover for real. I went to another college that was in the town, and not the Christian university. It was like the local, just, you know, state type college, whatever, public school. And they have, by the way, if you're looking for somebody to maybe talk to and don't necessarily have a high budget, you can sometimes go to these schools where they have people who are trying to graduate and they need clinic hours. So you can actually go and help a college student finish their credentials if they need to become an active counselor, and you can also get some help at a lower rate. They do sometimes even accept insurance. So I don't believe I had insurance at the time, but I, you know, worked with the sliding scale. I basically paid nothing because I was a student. I think it was like $5 a session or something crazy cheap like that. Like, that's insanely cheap for counseling.
Oh, yeah.
And she was the first one that introduced me to the whole cognitive behavioral therapy concept, that she thought that I would do better on just kind of learning some skills. And I remember she was the one that phrased it as building a tool belt for myself. So basically learning how to distract, delay, decide, like, you know, things like that. The naming it to tame it was something that I built based off of conversations with this counselor. So that was like one of the first ones I remember we built, because it wasn't like that she had a list of things to teach me. Like, it was a conversation. It was about me deciding what I could use. She was the first one to teach me like some of the anchoring and grounding methods you can use when you're having an anxiety attack, you know, which is start listing things you can see, touch, smell, just anything to bring you back into the present moment. So that was really the beginning of me being on a path where I knew I wasn't going to try again, right? Because it was interesting being like, I know I don't want to, but I wasn't sure that I wasn't going to not try again.
Right.
But do you know what I mean? So that's what kicked off okay, so if I want to not try again, I need to do something. So then that kicked off the therapy at the school, which then led to finding the therapy through the sliding scale. And then at that point, when we started doing the tool belt, that's what really like, okay, I can do this. I can do this. There are ways to manage how I feel inside that's not ending everything. Because something I picked up just across my years of talking to people too, I think the best thing I've ever heard about having those urges is that it's not necessarily that you want your entire self to go, but that there is something that is part of you that maybe should go, right? Like maybe a life change, which I would think that if you're at that point, it makes sense that there's part of you that's like, okay, something about this life needs to change.
Yeah.
So that I this isn't the urge that I have. And may it be from physical health to how you're eating to how you're doing your mental hygiene stuff, like, right? I think that is kind of appropriate, that means something about you needs to die or change. I know you kind of made a joke about tarot cards earlier, but, we have this very negative connotation with death. But a fun fact about tarot, and I'm not like a big tarot person, just going to throw that out there. This is just a dumb thing that I picked up at some point, is the death card isn't really always about death and dying, right? It's about something ending. So it can actually mean a good thing. So I think in a way, like, those urges are kind of misunderstood by ourselves, almost like how our entire culture misunderstands the death card. Like, It doesn't mean that I need to go. Just maybe a part of me needs to go or change.
Yeah, that's kind of where I found myself after 2019. I mean, because after I was able to somewhat get out of it and start functioning again, because I was bad. Like, after I tried it, like, I literally, apart from going to the bathroom, I didn't get out of bed for about a month and a half.
Yeah.
Like, it was so bad. Like, I mean, me, I have not had a car since 2015. And in Portland, when you work customer service and take public transportation, you're walking a lot. So, normally my old apartment to the Fred Meyer and back would be an easy peasy walk. But I took that walk and almost passed out at the Fred Meyer, and then almost passed out on the way back home because I had not moved so much. And, ultimately, I did discover, in myself that, I had been essentially taking my problems and shoveling them under the rug.
It turns out super not healthy, folks. Don't recommend. I just don't recommend it.
I mean, because it will eat you alive. It will. If you have to find a way to resolve your issues, no matter how tough they can be. And I think part of that too was me ultimately admitting to myself that the previous times I had been in therapy, I wasn't totally honest with the therapist, like I was embarrassed to talk about, my previous suicide attempts. So I didn't, and I also didn't talk about, some of, my issues in terms of anxiety, in terms of anger, because again, embarrassed. I didn't want to talk.
Oh yeah. I straight lied about the method for a while. Like, when I did open up about the fact that I had attempted suicide, I'll say the lie method. I had lied and said that I tried to take a bunch of pills and that my mother had found me and taken me to the emergency room, and that the jarring moment that I experienced was like, being in the hospital and having like my stomach, whatever, pumped or whatever. And none of that happened. And I've tried to unpack like why I wanted to lie about it. And I think the best I've come to, like, especially like talking to counselors later in life where I could kind of be honest about it and like some, self unpacking and shadow work, is I think the best rationale I had for it was that it is almost embarrassing to fail at that in a way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I know there's like even jokes about that concept about, failing so bad at that you even fail at, failing at life so bad that you even fail at ending life. And but there is a little bit of that stigma, right? Like, I failed at it, which can kind of compound things when you're first trying to process an attempt that you've made, right?
Yeah.
So I think I almost also I liked that somebody intervened. For some reason that made it easier that I didn't fail. Somebody stopped me from doing it. And I think there was almost that little daydream of like, right, somebody rescuing you. So I think those were kind of the two main drivers. So just because, by the way, that's what I kind of wanted to throw out there. There's a lot of pressure around talking about these subjects. And so we do have a knee-jerk reaction to lie in a way to make things be taken, I guess, as desirable as we would want them to be. I guess I don't know how to explain it, but just because somebody has maybe lied about something in relation to their attempt doesn't mean they are lying about the attempt. There's a lot of shame around the topic, I guess, is what I'm throwing out there.
Yeah, I think it's more society than anything else. Like, especially because of the religious connotation. I mean, there are a lot of religious people that, that do think that people that commit suicide are going to hell, which why does that make any sort of sense? Why would a loving God allow somebody who's in mental distress so bad that they kill themselves to go to hell?
Right. Like, I think it goes back to, I did have some really cool teachers like throughout that college. Like, there was a few that like kind of talked about, stuff like that, especially after Brian had passed, because they wanted to try to, fix where the school didn't seem super open about talking about it.
Right.
And a lot of the intention behind those passages were really more like, you can't be like, hey, I'm going to go be with Jesus, peace. Like, it was more to discourage that. I don't think it was talking about mental illness.
Yeah. Just like a lot of things in the Bible, people can interpret it any way they want to, have it fit whatever. But, ultimately, the important thing for me was being able to just be honest about it with myself and ultimately have the courage to talk to people about it. Like right now, I do have a wonderful therapist, teaching me some of the same things that you talked about your therapist, teaching you, and which this past week has helped me out so much. Just being able to for me, I'm a reactive type of person, and when something super emotional happens, my first instinct, fight or flight. I try to protect myself, and being able to take a deep breath, just a moment. And also too, that my therapist is kind of like teaching me to like focus on where the breath is. And I've noticed too, that if I do get really worked up about something, like my breathing will be more from my chest. So if you adjust that to like taking a deep breath from your diaphragm and just going from there, just taking that moment, that is good. And then the distraction method you talked about too has definitely helped me out too. Like if, you're in an extremely stressful situation, just focus on something else, and also what's been helping me out too is medication. I mean, we've talked about mental health meds before. I don't think mental health meds are necessarily something that everybody needs to constantly take for the rest of their lives, but it is a wonderful, wonderful tool for people in my spot, because, I'm still digging out of that hole from 2019, and a lot of the stresses that were still there and that were there in 2019 are still here now. And, the important thing for me is, again, not to hide it, be, open about it and, talk about it.
Yep. And then I know I've got doctor's appointments lined up for myself. So I am ready to, try to either get into counseling or see what I'd like to do about that, because I did think that I might try that before I go back on pills. I just haven't fully decided if I want to be on a medication or not. I think the spring is helping a lot. So I'm hoping if I can establish like a good therapeutic relationship with somebody, I could possibly just work through some stuff in the spring. I think I'm going to give myself until kind of August to make a final decision, get through this. But really one thing that I started doing, because I realized I was in a funk, was this week I've been going for 10-minute runs, because and I even found an article and I made like some quotable thing for maybe I'll share it. Like I'll make something just to share for mental health awareness on this too, because it is a fun fact that running for 10 minutes a day like can have a lot of positive influence on your mood and your executive functioning skills and ability to multitask. Mm-hmm. So I decided, hey, I'm in a funk, I should try to run. And so I didn't look up this article first, so I can't say that the article inspired it, but just 10 minutes a day. I wanted something about 10 minutes a day felt right. So it was really kind of cool to get to kind of, read that. So there's ways you can kind of look at it, right? Like there's no one path for anybody's mental hygiene routine. Like if your mental hygiene looks like taking an SSRI, or maybe keeping something like more like a Xanax or something that's more instantaneous, like a break in case of type pill was what I called like the ones that are a little bit more immediate. Like it's not like an SSRI where you need to take it over time for it to be helpful.
Right.
If that is involved in your mental hygiene, that is awesome. But you've got to find what works for you. My experience with the pill, like I said, wasn't super great when I thought about it. Like, because a lot of that was some of the decision to maybe try to talk to somebody. So just because Tim and I do certain things, I would never want it to come off like that is the answer. If you are a human out there who deals with invisible illness or anxiety or depression or PTSD or CPTSD or any of the multiple things that therapy or medication or a combination of those two could honestly help you. And a lot of the medications aren't considered forever meds anymore. There's a lot of doctors that have moved away from that mentality and do understand that not everybody is interested in being on like an SSRI for years. They more likely want to be on it for a handful of months, work through some things, maybe through some talking, or just help get yourself back into some healthy routines, right? Like
Yes.
if it can get you out of your way so you can establish things like jogging, eating healthy, and doing that, well, since those are all things that can help your mental attitude and health, like you might be able to get off the med, kind of similar to how you can have raised blood pressure, be on something temporarily, but if you change your lifestyle, you can sometimes get back off of that med. So you can think of it that way too if it's something that you're curious to try. It doesn't have to be a forever sentence. And there's a lot of people I feel like are put off in having the conversations of medications because they feel like it's got to be a forever thing. And I just want to just put the message as far out as I can that it is a perfectly reasonable and logical temporary thing to try, and sometimes long term, because that's
Yes.
not always a bad thing either. Every body and brain is fucking different. So what's going to work? It's not as easy as like everybody can't have the exact same thing work for them, right? It's just too individual.
And ultimately, the important thing here is just, you know, like I said, for me, I didn't start finding results until I was totally honest with, you know, my therapist and my doctor who's prescribing that medicine. You know, just if you are going with it through that mindset, then, you know, again, find what works for you. But, you know, ultimately, you got to have that honesty, because if you're not telling, you know, the doctor just one thing because you're embarrassed, or not telling your therapist, you know, something because you're embarrassed, it's not going to help you. I mean, it's no different than, you know, if you are developing signs of cancer or have a broken leg or something like that, and you don't tell the doctor what the problem is, they're not going to be able to fix it.
Right. And it does kind of stink. And I know Tim and I have talked about that we might be going into this sooner than later too, because we don't really have the healthcare system that also encourages people to go right when they have health problems, because, you know, a lot of times that is what puts people in very financially bad situations, is discovering something is going on with your body. So that's why it's like we are more likely to keep it to ourselves. And, you know, people who are well off, have good insurance, have a lot of money, are more likely to go to a doctor when they're experiencing issues early. So there's part of that plays into a lot of this too, is that people don't necessarily want to find out that it is something bad because they don't know if they honestly have the resources to really fight it and live a quality of life afterwards, right? Because you can survive the cancer, but if you've spent all of your money and end up going into bankruptcy and sometimes homelessness because of medical debt, right? Like there's a total chunk of that demographic that is due to medical debt. So it is kind of a complicated problem, but it is. Actually, are we ready to go into kind of some of the nerd out on this? Because I did look into, I wanted to know, like, is this kind of a bigger problem? Like, how prevalent is suicide? And the CDC actually covered it. So I just wanted to make sure, did you have anything else you wanted to cover on the personal end?
Not really, no. And I mean, this is the part of the show I know you love the best because you love your research. What did you research?
I do. And then, of course, I learned new things, too, as I always do, which is part of why I love doing this. So I did find facts about suicide on the cdc.gov. And, of course, we will include this in the show notes. So, number one, suicide is one of the leading causes of death and is a serious public health problem. And I'm pulling this quote just straight from the article because they put it more succinctly than I could, and they referenced studies. So please feel free. I always encourage people, if you're curious on something, click on a study, because sometimes you can even find like either, you know, little things that you might want to consider that they didn't, et cetera. So I always encourage people to dig in further. But here was their kind of summary of the studies they referenced. Suicide rates increased 30% between 2000 and 2018 and declined in 2019 and 2020. Suicide is a leading cause of death in the United States, with 45,979 deaths in 2020. This is about one death every 11 minutes, just to put that into perspective, guys. The number of people who think about or attempt suicide is even higher. In 2020, an estimated 12.2 million American adults seriously considered suicide. 3.2 million planned a suicide attempt and 1.2 million attempted suicide. So that being said, like, this does warrant some awareness. Like, that's why we wanted to talk about it. Is this isn't just me and Tim. This is a lot of people, and people who maybe aren't even as comfortable sharing their story. And I'm not saying you necessarily need to get on a podcast and share it like we did, but I do think there is something of finding somebody to talk to so that you can make sure you are taking those medical steps for what is an illness in your brain.
And take a look at the dates in question where it talks about being raised 30%. I mean, what happened in 1 year after 2000? September 11th. And look how much the world has gone completely to shit in that time. Like think about the fact that, like people today don't really want to bring kids in the world. Like pregnancy rates are down, because of everything going on in the world. So it seeing that number doesn't shock me, but it's still like, fuck.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, oh God, okay, I'm not alone. Because, hey, what's funny is I really doubt we're in those numbers. Nobody ever asked me if you ever attempted. So that goes back to when you hear stuff like this, you need to put that little asterisk in your head of at least. Because it's kind of like you can't prove the not end of it, right?
Yeah,
it's that kind of concept in studies.
Yeah, not everybody is going to be, caught and brought in for like a 72-hour hold. A lot of people attempt it, like you and I both tried and didn't work, and then we didn't tell people.
Yep.
So.
Exactly. I did not tell anybody, especially medically. I didn't open up to counselors about that. I'm actually wondering if I ever did actually admit to the attempt. I know I talked about the thoughts, but I was scared to admit the attempt part of it because I didn't want that to be on my record in case it made things worse. And I had already decided I didn't want to do that again. So I wanted to make sure it wasn't tied to me forever. So I did kind of remember that, like being a little bit of why I didn't share it first was a fear of the stigma of having that label and it affecting my life worse.
Right.
And then another fact is suicide does have a far-reaching impact. And I did find this pretty interesting. They did, of course, talk about emotional, physical, and other long-term effects on health, like, for example, for survivors. And even, the mental health of people who survived somebody's successful attempt or even those who survived somebody's failed attempt. I hate to call it a failed attempt, but that's kind of the best way to sum it up. But I found the information on the societal impact the most surprising out of this. A quote from them again: the financial toll of suicide on society is also pretty costly. In 2019, suicide and non-fatal self-harm cost the nation either $490 billion, that's with a B, in medical costs, work loss costs, value of statistical life, and quality of life costs. So, yeah, again, it goes back into that's why I do want to talk about this and raise awareness, is it's costing us. It's costing us in financial ways that maybe it doesn't need to.
Yeah, I mean, it could be something simple as, let's say somebody takes some pills, doesn't work, but they have to miss a couple of days of work. That's lost money right there. Or something more serious. They have to go to the hospital or,
Well, and to not be cold about it, because, I mean, I think we do talk a lot about the emotional cost, right? Like we have been a little bit more open to that as a culture, but I did find it interesting, and something that people might not think about is that actual cold hard logic end of it, and that is that it does cost the taxpayer money, right? Like in that weird way, there's also a very non-emotional logical reason that our society should care about this. It's not necessarily about, the huggy feelies of it. There is also the logic side of it too, that this costs money, that takes from other programs. And then the last thing, and that also just goes to suicide can be prevented. So we don't have to have this leading cause of death issue. We don't necessarily have to have all of the emotional, physical effects that it has on people's mental wellness. And we don't have to have the cold, logical cost that it has on our society, right? And basically, I thought it was kind of cool that the CDC talked about that they had developed a preventing suicide program, and it's a technical package of policy, programs, and practices. Because their overall stance on this was that suicide prevention requires a comprehensive public health approach. And they just kind of have this cool pamphlet out there. It's like strategies to prevent suicide involves strengthening economic supports, which is strengthening household financial security and housing stabilization policies. There's also attacking it by strengthening access to and delivery of suicide care. That goes back into our healthcare system, coverage of mental health conditions by health insurance policies, and not accidentally tagging somebody with a label, right? That stigma that I was scared of. The list goes on, and we'll include the link, and it's all in there if you guys want to look at that. But a lot of it is just getting it adopted by like certain states and your local areas. Like these are programs that you can support. I think if you're the type of person that goes to like city councils, this is the type of thing you could bring up. So if you are one of those humans out there that happens to listen that goes to things like that, and you do care about suicide awareness and kind of how it can affect your community, there are programs by the CDC and other ones probably that are trying to help like get into this and teach like some, prevention stuff, and even postvention, the concept of taking care of somebody after the fact and using it as this was a symptom, not something they should be punished for, right? Because that was the other part, was I was terrified I was going to get punished because I attempted homicide on myself, and there are some states that will treat it as such.
Yeah, and I think we know which states.
Well, I mean, I don't off the top of my head, so feel free to fact check that. If that is some old-fashioned knowledge and that does not exist anymore, please feel free to correct me. But considering we're going back in time in some states, and with the Supreme Court, kind of, I don't think that those changed in those states. So I'm pretty sure there's still at least a handful that can charge you with like basically a homicidal attempt.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately what this boils down to is like we need a better healthcare system in this country. I mean, I remember the conversation we had with Officer Ray Cyphers, Sheriff Ray Cyphers, when he talked about, how in the 60s, like mental health institutions, thanks to corruption, starting being shut down. And then, of course, you had the 80s with Reagan cutting back, funding for, mental health services even more, which saw an increase in homelessness and whatnot. And the evidence is clear that, if we don't, put resources towards fixing this problem, it's going to get worse.
Yep. Just like with a lot of our healthcare issues, there's a lot to be said on what prevention can do and what it could even save, and not just lives, but it goes back to, if you want to look at it on the logical side of it, it also saves a lot of money. Like as a society, as a culture, as a big group of people who are very aware of how much we spend in healthcare, but then also realizing that we spend more on it because of how much of our tax paying dollars ends up also going into that system. So there's kind of like a double pay in to our healthcare where you're paying into it anyway, but then if you do need care, you're paying more into it. Right? Because, how the systems work. Whether or not you agree with it, that's how it works.
Right. What other research did you find?
So the last one, and I'm actually going to keep this really tight because I think we've kind of talked about enough of things, but I did want to include this article because it's similar to one that I had found well after my attempt that kind of really also helped solidify that I know for a fact I don't want to try again. Like I feel like it really helped put that nail in that decision of like, no, I think I am now beyond the hump that I won't do this again. Like, no longer I know I don't want to versus I now know that I won't. So I don't know if this was the exact same article, but I found something called The Jumpers by Psychology Today. I do encourage you to read it. I will warn you, much like this, it could be kind of triggering. It does. It focuses on a man named Ken Baldwin who attempted but fell feet first, which I guess is pretty much the only way you can survive the fall from the Golden Gate Bridge, because this is actually talking about, it mentions that the Golden Gate Bridge is like one of the most popular destinations. It has like a 98% fatality rate from that, falling from that height into water. but because he fell feet first, like it really hurt him. Like he didn't like just swim out, but they did kind of talk about his experience. But he did talk about specifically that when he came to on the deck of the rescue boat, so right after it happened, a Coast Guard asked him if he knew what he'd just done or if he'd want to do it again. And Ken said very specifically that even at that moment, right then, he knew he'd never try to end his life again. Although he hadn't broken any bones, there was severe bruising to his lungs, and he spent the night in intensive care with only a 50% chance of survival. Now, he did survive, right? Because there was this interview that was done. So, yeah, it was a whole process. But something that the article did go into, that, again, it kind of goes back to he came up from it and he knew he didn't want to do that again. So immediately it takes me back to kind of that feeling of like, well, when I kind of came to for my experience, I knew that was something I never wanted to do again. And I guess it was interesting to read that I wasn't alone in that either. The article mentions this, but it says in 1975, when only 10 people were known to have survived jumping off that bridge, which nerdy fact, that figure is now 26. The psychologist David Rawson sought out and interviewed 7 of them. He found that all of them had spiritual experiences during or straight after their jumps. They experienced feelings of intense peace and calm and awareness of a higher power and are connected to other human beings or the universe as a whole. And this state never faded. Although in some cases it was several years since their jump, they had all retained this sense of meaning and well-being. In other words, they had undergone a permanent spiritual transformation. Most jumpers black out on hitting the water, but 2 of Roson's interviewees remained conscious and had profound spiritual experiences. So, I mean, it is kind of interesting to take it to that spiritual end, because I guess I could see that, right? Like if you were so on the end of it and then you came out of an experience not wanting to do that anymore, that's right. A pretty life-changing shift. And that's where it's like, I'm not sure this is the same one. Because again, it goes back to my timeline is super foobarred a lot of because probably that attempt and like other things that factor into memory and CPTSD and stuff like that. But I did remember reading that when they interviewed the people who survived bridge jumps, that pretty much all of them said that about halfway down, they had realized that there was another decision. Like there were other ways to work through the problem, in quotes, the problem that like spurred making the attempt. And so that was honestly kind of relieving for me. To read that other people, you know, and then that the recidivism rate isn't very high. I did learn in that CDC article, it was something that they mentioned was more than 90% of people who attempt suicide and survive never go on to die by suicide. So, you know, it kind of even fits back into that piece of that there can be something of an awakening moment, if you want to call it spiritual, if you just want to call it a wake-up call, whichever, right? That can seem to happen, that you realize like, oh shit, like I could have not done this. Like there's totally actually like maybe I could have gone to therapy, or I could have, you know, tried getting on a medication and not, you know, if you're not ready to talk about things, I'm just saying that, you know, some people maybe realized there were other paths on the way down. And that was the general sense that I had gotten. So again, like it was just kind of nice to not feel alone in that. Yeah, I know I don't want to do that feeling afterwards.
And I think that's kind of the goal of what we've been trying to do here today. Just if you are listening to this and you are having any sort of thoughts, you know, like the disclaimer at the start, you know, there is help out there. Get help. There's, you know, even though you think your situation may be hopeless, it's not. You know, you know, even if that means, you know, you have to go through some bad stuff, you know, in order to resolve your issues, there is light on the other end. You know,
yes, there is life after trauma. I will say it is okay to not be okay. But it's not okay to not be okay for a prolonged time. So if you feel like you've been not okay for a prolonged time, do consider reaching out and seeing what resources are in your area. You might be surprised at what you can find if you can find a sliding scale doctor, and if your situation is that you can show that you can't afford much. It's amazing what you can find out there. It does kind of suck that, you know, here in America, it's not as easy as it can be in other places to get assistance. But there's even, some support groups that you can talk to, that you can kind of find. That's kind of one of the cool things about the internet, is that you can sort of search with a little more ability to find those groups. Oh yeah, there's meetup groups that might even be support group related. I don't know. I haven't gone personally on Meetup to find a support group because support groups aren't personally my bag of going into it. But I do understand there's a lot of people that would prefer to do it that way. And also it tends to be low cost, no cost. You know what I mean? So as far as trying to find those out there and keeping it accessible, I do support the idea of, I support support groups, guys. And there's even some online ones. I just say be very careful with those, because sometimes it turns into an arena for people to just kind of share really negative stuff. And that's not necessarily the stuff you want to be taking in if you're struggling with some of the thoughts mentally, because that could, not always help. So.
Yeah, the important thing, just talk. I mean, it's get help.
Take some action, even if it's just try jogging. You want to try some of the brain hack stuff? See if you can jog for 10 minutes, or even just breaking a sweat at all. See if you could do jumping jacks while you're watching something on TV. You can kind of there's a lot to do, right? There are things to try. And if you can get yourself to trying, that is already a huge fucking step. And that's anything. I mean, there's so many things out there that can be considered therapeutic. There's gardening, there's going on jogs, there's going out and actually just going to some of the meetup stuffs and getting out and outside and interacting with people. So I mean, it goes back to, I don't want to say that there's one answer for everybody, but if you have not been okay for a prolonged period of time, I do encourage some form of action in some way to just help break you from your funk. That's actually, I think, something I had explained to Tim just before the show, is that I had started running because of the funk. So.
Yeah. And there is such a thing as a runner's high. I mean, I used to run cross country in high school, and, after you get done with a race, everything's so nice and you're so happy.
Oh, I only experienced what I would call a true runner's high once. And it was during a 5K. It was really random. It was crazy. Because it was just it felt like somebody had slipped me something, and suddenly I was randomly kind of high on a drug for a minute. It was just how my heart felt. And I was trying to explain it to the Mr. Reverend, because I had never even heard of the term. I mean, I guess I'd heard of it, but I didn't ever take it as a technical high, a high feeling. And so when I explained it, he just kind of laughed at me, not laughing at me, but he chuckled and kind of that was a runner's high. You're okay. Your heart's not exploding. Because of course my brain, the anxiety was just oh my God, I almost died. I probably just had a heart attack during my run and I had no idea.
I have cancer. No.
I don't know how to interpret good feelings.
I'm feeling good. Shit.
I'm feeling good. Oh crap, I'm dying. Is this the euphoria? Am I going to see the light? But I'm fine, guys. Spoiler alert, I lived. But yeah, so it is kind of, but yeah, there's a lot to physical health and how it ties into your mental health. So I would throw it out there that if you don't have the means to go see a counselor, maybe entertain doing something, physical health wise. I won't say that running is free, right? Because you do have to buy sneakers, but sometimes that is more accessible and more it's also just easier sometimes, because if you're worried about that stigma and being around people, it's something you can do that's a little bit more private that can have an effect. And sometimes just starting some of those chemicals moving in your brain can even make you feel better about doing other things, to then maybe you'll start feeling better about the idea of going to a group or going to talk to somebody, or even just talking to your doctor about wanting to be on something temporarily. Because I would say that's probably the more psychotherapy separated version of that, would be to get on something low dose and to just touch base with your doctor, just to make sure your other vitals and things are going fine, as long as you're still working through things. But there are a lot of ways to kind of approach mental hygiene once you realize you need to be practicing mental hygiene.
Indeed. And I think that's a good cutoff point here. So I think we will wrap it up for the week, unless you have anything further you wanted to say.
Oh, no, that is absolutely it. Thank you guys for listening along, especially if this was something that you were iffy about listening to. I hope we managed to cover it in a way that was good for you, right? Like, I definitely don't want anybody coming out of this somehow feeling worse about this topic. I'm hoping if you do have a story that you feel comfortable telling, you open up and talk about it and start to repair some of those pieces in you.
Indeed, because there is hope. There is hope.
Yes, there is hope.
All right, so I think we'll wrap it up here. Thank you all for listening. Every Saturday, we'll have something in this podcast space to entertain your ear holes. Until we meet again, we bid you adieu.
It feels good to be alive, guys.
Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy on iTunes, the Google Play Music Store, as well as Spotify. Remember to support Friends Talking Nerdy on Patreon. Goodbye, darling.